so people will pop in while we get it started here. Yeah, welcome everybody to the fourth session of the Geography of Sustainability Transitions webinar. Before we get started with the content of this session, I would like to maybe make a short organizational arrangement. So as you know, many of you might have realized we had to cancel the session with Michaela Trippel and Markus Steen last week on a very short notice. So yeah, we really apologize for the short notice there. Michaela had to cancel the event for personal reasons. And we tried to find a substitution date so she could still hold her presentation and we could have the session before Christmas. But this turned out to be actually impossible. So we decided to basically postpone the session with her to a potential next webinar series, which we hope to pull off in next spring. So this means that this session will be lacking from this sort of webinar series, but and we will basically conclude it with the roundtable as planned on next Wednesday. For today's session, it's the same rules as in the last one. So basically, we opened the Q&A and the chat feature on Zoom. So if you have questions on the content of the presentation and the discussant, then please put them in the Q&A section. And if you have other side discussions or sort of technical issues, then please use the chat function for that. And yeah, it's the same format as in the last sessions. We have a mini keynote followed by a short discussant and then an open Q&A of about half an hour. So that's it. I pass the word on to Bernhard Truffer, who will be moderating today's session and Q&A.
Well, thanks a lot, Christian. And it's my very pleasure to introduce Jim Murphy to you. He's sort of he's a professor at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And this is one of the top 3, as I'm told, geography institutes in the US. And he's also an editor-in-chief in economic geography, which is also among the top 3 journals in the field. So we're very happy to have him as a prolific speaker. Let's say I would just allow myself to chip off another minute or two to motivate a little bit more who you're confronted with in a minute. You know, who Jim is really in the context of geography of transitions, really. I personally met for the first time Jim 10 years ago. It's almost 10 years ago, when some old Dutch transition friends invited me to Worcester, Massachusetts, to give a lecture on geography of transitions. And I went there just without any hopes or expectations, because I thought, well, it's first, you know, it's transitions was a weird concept, especially in North America. And the geography of transitions was just about to emerge. So I arrived there, and the first thing I got was some meetings with PhD students. And then they came to me and said, you know, we have this one professor, he tortures us with all these sort of regimes and multi-level perspective, etc. And then shortly thereafter, after my talk, and I met him at the lunch, you know, and we clicked immediately. So this was the start of a beautiful relationship, as they say in the Casablanca movie, ever since. And for me, Jim has been one of the first full economic geographers to engage with transition, to see something in transition studies, and more remarkably, really in the US, because it was really considered then largely a sort of a European thing. And, you know, when I presented the stuff in the US, I was often confronted with sort of disbelief, you know. And so, you know, it's really about him being a pioneer in this field. And he always brought, you know, in the geography perspective very strongly. And so with Tim, it became really sort of a shared platform, an interdisciplinary platform between transition studies and economic geographers. And so, you know, that's also what this webinar is all about, to really be a place to meet and exchange ideas from different venues, so to speak. So without further ado, that was my 2 minutes chip off, you know. Jim, the floor is yours. Please elaborate.
Okay, great. Got it. Thanks so much, Bernhard, as always. And thank you, Christian, Lars, Miriam, and Jonas for this really fantastic series that we've been able to put together. And it's just been really stimulating. So I, of course, as I normally do, have too much stuff to cover. So I'm going to get right into it and start my clock and make sure I stick to time. So this is a basic overview. I mean, really what I want to do is talk about how we think about cities and what cities do and how they function, and then thinking about placemaking dynamics and how they shape transitions. And these are both coming out of my history as kind of an economic urban development geographer who works particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So what I wanted to start with, though, is a kind of provocation of sorts, which is to say, what about development in transition studies? And it's really interesting to me because we talk a lot about transitions, but I think sometimes it's unclear where we're transitioning to in terms of what it means for people's lives, their livelihoods, questions of poverty. And I put there the Sustainable Development Goals just to give you a sense of all these different kinds of outcomes that we can think about. And this, of course, is particularly significant to me because of where I work and what's going on in the places that I work. So I think there's an interesting question about whether or not sustainability transitions are always even and developmentally progressive for everybody, and then how we can do better work to kind of examine those outcomes and to link transition research to development, I think, more explicitly. And it doesn't matter if you're working in the global south or the global north, I would say. For me, you know, I've been working in Africa for almost 30 years now. And what's happening today is this massive transition. It's an urban transition. It's a transition of mega cities and large cities and growing cities. And the question for me has always been, well, what are these cities doing in terms of the development promise that is supposed to be associated with urbanization? If you go back to the World Bank Development Report of 2009, they're talking about, you've got to have urbanization, and that leads to urbanization economies, specialization economies, and you get development and industrialization. But in Africa today, we're not seeing industrialization rise, and we're not seeing sustainable cities come into being in any remote sense of the term. In fact, cities are highly unequal. So there's huge development challenges and huge gaps between the haves and have-nots in these cities. So this is one of the things that got me interested in sort of thinking about what cities do, how they function, and how we can frame cities in different ways to better capture not just the sectoral regimes that we may be interested in around energy and water, for example, but also the ways in which those articulate with other activities that are essential for cities. And one way to think about this very briefly is, in urban geography and economic geography, cities are central places. They concentrate wealth, they concentrate knowledge, they concentrate labor. And this in turn can create these kinds of urbanization and specialization economies that can be generative of development, right? And so we can think about cities, this is the ideal, right? This is the fundamental kind of thing about why cities matter. Why do we have cities in the first place? And so cities in their ideal sense can generate development through sort of this ability to create exchange value in the wider global economy or national economy, and through the sort of holding down of that value that's captured in the form of collective goods and services that facilitate development. And ideally, these can be sustainable. But cities can also be parasitic, you could argue. They can grow at the expense of the poor. They can grow at the expense of the environment. They can grow in the interests of the elite. And we see this increasingly happening with questions around rights to the city, and questions around why global cities have such large homeless populations, gentrification issues, and things like this. So I think it's interesting to kind of put these two binaries, this binary in here, but to also say it's not one or the other. Like, I don't think that's what I'm saying here, but I think it's interesting to think about how most cities are really have a little bit of both of these things going on in them, right? So and within different segments of the population. So a city like San Francisco is clearly generating all this innovation and global knowledge and exchange value, but at the same time, if you work at a Starbucks in San Francisco, you can't afford to live near the central part of that city probably, because you're essentially there's no affordable housing and those kinds of things. So I think that was the big thing to get me to think about sort of what cities do, how they're doing it. And then this pushed me into this kind of work I've been doing with Bernard for a decade now, as he noted, which has gotten me really even more interested in thinking about the sociotechnical issues associated with cities and urban transitions. And here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this conceptualization because we don't have the time, and it's in the paper that's cited here. But part of the thing I got interested in was thinking about not just like how does the sanitation regime work and how is it, servicing the population, but how is that regime shaped by the other things that go on in cities? The productive activities, the consumption activities. And so I started to think about thinking about these different kinds of regimes that are kind of interrelated to one another around cities, and thinking about cities in a slightly more holistic way, heuristically perhaps, to think about them being constituted by production, consumption, and infrastructure regimes, or what you might call sectoral regimes. Production regimes are about sort of production, manufacturing, kind of the exchange value, the economic and industrial activities that go on in cities, and then consumption regimes being more about the use value of cities, how people consume the city, what their quality of life is like, et cetera, and so forth. And the framework that gets developed here is this, and it's sort of to think about the interactions and intersections between these different regimes, and thinking about regimes as being constituted really through these kinds of generic kind of practices that are associated with the way consumers operate in the city, the way producers operate, the way infrastructure managers and service providers operate. And then there's particular forms of governance associated with it. So the take-home point to me is that generative urbanization or sustainability transitions perhaps depends not only on having a good infrastructure regime or a sectoral regime, but the ways in which that regime is articulated or aligned with or coupled to these other activities that go on in cities, because they can have there's a relationship there that can either be progressive in terms of helping to push production into greener spaces or greener ways, or it can work the opposite way as well. And that these alignments or couplings can be seen if we look at these practices that go on in these regimes and the kinds of forms of governance, the institutions, the regulatory, the normative aspects of them. And thinking about these couplings as being kind of associated with flows, interdependencies, power relations, and the like. We can talk more about this. I just don't have the time to go into the great detail. But here's the big point of all this is that these alignments between these kind of production and consumption and infrastructure regimes, really we need to think about conceptualizing them as either being generative, right? They're complementary. They facilitate and kind of accelerate positive progressive changes, greener changes in all activities, right? In the consumption, in the production, as well as in the infrastructure. Or in some cases, they can be malaligned, right? They can be aligned in a way that kind of promotes a kind of regressive downgrading, negative externalities, exclusions, splintering, more of that parasitic urbanization. Or they can be non-aligned is another way to think about that, where there's mismatches between the practices that go on in them, the modes of governance, the infrastructures, and these can in turn limit the uptake efficacy of niche innovations or technological upgrading. So I think the point is to get when these initiatives around sustainability are put in place, that there has to be a much more conscious attempt to understand how they're going to articulate or align with the other activities that are essential for cities. Production and consumption are essential parts of what cities do and why they exist. So in looking at these kinds of questions around alignments, my work in Africa has been clear in showing that mal and non-alignments are the norm between these regimes. And there's 3 quick illustrative cases I'll go through here, and then we'll get to placemaking. The first is Dar es Salaam, where we have a booming megacity. This is a city that's growing beyond belief at an incredible pace. And it's growing economically, but that growth is really a function more of natural resource sectors and the offshoring of profits to places like China and elsewhere. So there's a kind of the city is serving as kind of a node for extraction of wealth, and it's in a highly unequal city. Infrastructure regimes are wholly inadequate to deal with the growing populations, as expansion of the informal sector, low income for most people, at the same time, some hyper wealthy people, right? Of course, and gated communities. But formal employment's unable to keep growth with the population, and consumption regimes are kind of marked by low household income, high cost of living, including for infrastructure, things like housing in particular. And this effectively reduces any kind of demand for upgraded or greener infrastructure regimes. So even if you have the right technology, the demand for some of these things is not really there. And so what we have is we have kind of a situation where we have mal and non-alignments in Dar es Salaam that kind of facilitate a particular form of parasitic urbanization and limit the prospects for sustainability transitions. And again, you can look at that paper if you want more details. And this is in Nairobi, we're seeing very similar situation. Again, I'm not going to go through the details here. Splintering and fragmenting. This is some work with Evog and Mara Van Wely and Bernard and Pauline Chirunya, and you know, same kind of situation. And the point here is that this increasing inequality is really striking, and it is really limits the potential for sustainability transitions. The third case here is a more recent thing I did with Richard Grant Park Carmody, is looking at this special economic zone that was built in the Western Cape of South Africa near Cape Town. And here was an attempt to establish a green tech industrial zone that had significant support, a lot of some foreign investment and community buy-in. And it's an interesting case because it's in a deindustrialized township, a black township, where it's being located. So it's trying to generate this formal employment. The problem is that when you scale this thing out to the wider national political economy in South Africa, green tech is not really something that's viewed as a great idea for people in the mineral sector, transport, and the coal-based energy sector, which generates lots of employment. So there's a lot of resistance to this idea of greening the energy sector in South Africa because of union opposition and fears of people losing their jobs. At the same time, you still have the apartheid legacy, which has limited collective goods, particularly education. So it's not really well aligned with the wider consumption regime that's available to people. There isn't the kind of labor training possibilities to get those kind of high quality green tech jobs to particularly the majority black population. And poverty and depressed wages, generally speaking, limit the uptake of green technology. So even if you build this sector, doesn't necessarily have the kind of market ready to tap into that is hoped for. So that just kind of gives you a sense of some ways to think through these interactions around regimes and how they can influence sustainability, particularly related to alignments. So for the rest of this time, I just want to talk briefly about place and placemaking. And part of this is material that I think is a little bit more familiar to many in transitions, particularly in the geo transitions. It stems out of some work I did a long time ago with Joe Pierce and Deb Martin at Clark, and then with Steve McCauley, and then a paper I wrote in 2015. And it's had some interesting traction where we're starting to see some interesting, particularly grassroots perspectives on social movements pushing for particular kinds of transitions and thinking about placemaking as a strategy to achieve transitions. And one of the questions is always whose voices count and who and what are transitions for here. And here we can think about geographical understandings of place. That place is much more than a site or a location. It also has meanings attached to it, affect. It's multi-scalar. It's historically constituted temporally. It's got materialities to it. It's relationally constituted. And that placemaking is a social, economic, and political processes that define and transform the meaning and constitution of places in transition. And place frames are particularly essential for this, and these reflect shared understandings that emerge through these placemaking dynamics, and these frames are mobilized as part of collective action strategies. And so, again, if you the piece Pierce, Martin, and Murphy really does the work of this slide, which is to think about relationalities and relational placemaking, to think about multi-scalar place, to think about the ways in which network relationships and coalitions that kind of form around place frames are critical to empowering and realizing certain visions about what a place can become. And transitions, as we know, are all about futures, right? They're about sort of certain imaginaries about what a place can be. It can be a greener, juster kind of place, ideally, right? And so I think the place framing approach is a really useful one to kind of get us to think through that. So in applying this, I can go through two quick examples and give you a sense of this. The first relates to some work I've done in Zanzibar, the archipelago that's part of the Republic of Tanzania. And here, I first was in Zanzibar in 1995, and it was essentially like a backpacker tourism, very small tourism industry, relatively speaking. It was a spice island, fishing, agriculture. And in the 25 years since that time, it has now become a massive tourism destination relative to its size. And part of the way that this occurred was through this kind of the production of this particular kind of global destination place frame that was kind of constructed particularly by investors through the liberalization of the investment environment, the Zanzibar Investment Promotion Agency. It was by seeing Zanzibar as an alternative to the Kenyan coast. It was safer. You still had this African experience. It was exotic. But it was secular, and you had these safe enclave beach spaces and these kinds of things. And so this particular frame comes into being, and it's very much empowered by the political system as well as by all this capital. Airbnb is now huge in Zanzibar. TripAdvisor as a technological intermediary is very essential for producing this frame. In contrast, you have this more less empowered, weaker frame, as it were, that's associated with Zanzibaris, I would say, and with certain kinds of tourism interests that want to create a kind of heritage model, a boutique model of tourism, a much smaller scale model. But this frame is not really very well assembled together, in part because there's some significant differences between, say, boutique tourist operations and people who are don't want really Western tourists there because of their religious beliefs and these kinds of things. And so these two frames are kind of been in competition. And in the middle, you kind of see these crossover point where you have these actors like the tour operators and some of the politicians and Stone Town as a UNESCO World Heritage Site as crossing over between these frames and really serving as interesting points where they kind of come together in sometimes very problematic ways. And in this case, when you look at this placemaking process in Zanzibar, you can see that the power of the firms and investors in producing this global destination frame is really enabled this frame to kind of take over and has resulted in really problematic, uneven development. So favoring foreign direct investment, indigenous firms have little influence, inclusive resorts, you bring the tourists in mass quantities, you take them right from the airport to the beach enclave. They don't stop and consume anything local. There's a lot of imported labor and a consolidation, crowding out of some of the tour operators through these powerful hotel interests. And the state is really captured by these interests or is unable or unwilling to guide foreign direct investment strategically. And as a result, we have these huge unevenness in terms of infrastructure challenges, material challenges, social and political unrest is on the rise. Extremism is occurring now because some very conservative Muslims don't particularly like bikini-clad tourists, interacting with bikini-clad tourists. I mean, it's fairly straightforward, and there's a lot of displacement of locals. So here we get a very uneven development going on. So that's one case of this, and the second very brief case I'll go through and then I'll finish is a more hopeful case. And this is the case that's based on Sophie Van Nest and Deb Martin, my colleagues' work looking at automobility challenges in the city of Montreal. And this is a really interesting paper that looks at these different frames around a highway that was proposed. And it was framed as kind of, sustaining the industrial character of the city of Montreal and generating employment. But then once this frame got enacted and supposedly the highway was going to get built, but then these environmental and health organizations constructed an alternative frame that was about pollution, urban design, and the problems of increased car traffic. And this new place frame was mobilized quite successfully in opposition to automobility. And what's interesting about this paper is they get at these kind of moments of place framing in a really nice way, I think, in thinking about these particular tasks that you can associate with place framing, naming and blaming, claiming, and then practicing, and then associating these particular moments or these tasks with particular discursive articulations, and then the relationalities, the networks that kind of emerged to support that particular articulation. And so it's a really interesting way to kind of walk through this and get a heuristic of sorts to understand how place framing works and how it can kind of really be useful to understand potential points of engagement to kind of resolve conflicts, but also what the basis of those conflicts really are beyond perhaps rather superficial understandings. Okay, so just to close, I did a good job. So the question here is development outcomes and transitions. So what about that? Can we think more about development outcomes? Thinking about reconceptualizing cities to better capture the more holistic things that are associated with them. Thinking about production, consumption, and infrastructure regimes and these alignments between regimes. And then placing transition dynamics and conflicts. So thinking about sustainability transitions as about placemaking processes, a means through niche, which niches and emerging transform regimes become legitimated and empowered through meanings, discourse, and material changes. And place-based transitions involve that are about competing place frames. I'm sorry, I wrote this slide too quick, but there's about competing place frames. We need to think about that. And on that note, I will gladly stop and hand it over to Lars.
Well, thanks a lot, Jim, for this very broad, but at the same time very deep presentation. And it was very dense and nourishing, of course, as we know you. So I guess then the next step is for Lars Kunan, just to serve as a discussant. And Lars is a professor at Bergen University in Norway, and he has been among the few inventors of the geography of transitions from a transition studies point of view. Lars, the floor is yours. I would also have an anecdote for you, but I will not chip off your time.
All right, then we'll take that later. Okay, thanks a lot, Jim. I really enjoyed your talk, and very helpful. Grateful that you made such substantive slides, which helped me to prepare this discussion somewhat. Right. So I'm particularly happy also about the Montreal case study. My previous home, Melbourne, is unfortunately a city that's still very much locked into automobility, and I'm sort of pleased to see that, that there's still hope for these kinds of cities. Let me focus on a couple of, first of all, on a couple of takeaways that I got from this talk. And the first is really about, I think, what has been a pretty fat elephant in the room for sustainability transitions research, and that is the sustainability in sustainability transitions. And I think by raising questions about development, you're very much addressing the question, so what about sustainability transitions in terms of sustainability outcomes? And I think, indeed, a spatial perspective, a place-based perspective, is very helpful then to also concretize those sort of developmental outcomes, and also to draw attention to potential trade-offs and not sort of assume in a sort of perfect world as that of the Sustainable Development Goals that all sustainability outcomes are sort of perfectly in alignment with each other. And we just sort of go for a sort of a triple bottom line. Now, I think your framework really provides also some methodological purchase in the sense that it beds really well for doing comparative research. And I'm skipping now to my fourth point, but I'm saying that because I still sort of sometimes struggle with the way that a lot of theory development happens in sustainability transitions. And that is because a lot of the initial theorizations were based on historical research with the big benefit of hindsight. And there is really sort of still a methodological challenge that when we are now dealing with sustainability transitions, we are smack in the middle of the transition and we don't have the benefit of hindsight, even though I think, as time progresses, we increasingly are able to, to do sort of process analysis of contemporary sustainability transitions. But as geographers, we can do a much better job also in sort of identifying leverage points, where there's agency in accelerating and constraining transitions by, the virtue of spatial variation. And, I think we need sort of solid analytical frameworks that allow for systematic comparative research of sustainability transitions across space. And I think your framework around consumption, production, and infrastructure regimes is one of those sort of examples of a framework can do that job. I think it also then sort of points to the value of geography in providing grounded theory development. And I think there are potential lessons for sustainability transitions where there's been so much reproduction of the theoretical frameworks that don't really sort of contribute to new substantive theory developments, but just sort of show that there are niches and technological innovation system dynamics happening in very many different countries, but not really explaining what sort of theoretical lessons can be learned from that. Okay, and then finally, I think what has been really a takeaway from me here has been that your work really goes beyond what we observed in our review in 2015 to be sort of a singular fascination with the geography of niches and sort of formative dynamics in technological innovation systems when it comes to sort of the engagement of geographers and sort of spatial and regional scholars with sustainability transitions. Now that then helps me to kind of move to some further sort of reflections and more sort of maybe critical comments on the presentation. And the first is really around your conceptualization of the city as a socio-technical system. And I appreciate, and you already mentioned it also in the talk, that you didn't really have time to fully elaborate on that. But it seems to me that in the current sort of conceptualization, you very much acknowledge, I think, social sustainability, but I just wonder there about also, the environmental sustainability and to what extent, your framework sort of maybe overplays a bit the sociotechnical conceptualization, and there's a lot of work going on, obviously, around socioecological conceptualizations and systems in relation to urban sustainability transitions. And in that sense, you seem to sort of subscribe a bit to a very anthropocentric sort of term around sustainable urban development as sort of mainly mattering for quality of life of people. So some thoughts around that would be appreciated. And then and this was particularly actually coming, from reading your paper, I was wondering about sort of where you would locate innovation and sort of change agency in your various regimes. And even though I think your conceptualization of the city as a sort of socio-technical system and how these sort of regimes are manifested, it does a lot of justice to better understanding urban sustainability transitions, because they are not sort of just limited to specific sectors, but you have a lot of sort of sectoral crossovers in cities. There's lots of nexuses between energy and water, et cetera. But by focusing so very strongly on a regime, I sort of feel that, agency gets a bit underplayed. And that's obviously, a strength in the MLP model, is that, due to the duality of nation regimes, there's a clear space for innovation and, disruption, even though that sort of agency is probably a bit overplayed in the MLP model. So, and that then sort of leaves me to also with an open question about, what has been very much emphasized in the urban sustainability transition literature is, the role and the importance of experimentation. So I just wondered where, in your sort of understanding of urban sustainability transitions, where that sort of experimentation happens and by whom, right? And then another point, my empirical sort of stomping grounds are not developing economies or Africa, but more sort of limited to working in Europe and recently also in Australia. But in doing that, I think, there is an interesting sort of parallel development happening there also that is related to questions around social sustainability, but which have been much more framed through the term of sort of, calling attention for the foundational economy of cities and regions, referring to sort of those sort of parts of the economy that provide goods and services, and which are in fact the social and material infrastructures of civilized life, because they provide the daily essentials of all households. And I just sort of was wondering how, that understanding of the foundational economy sits within your framework, because it seems to sort of much more, take away that distinction between sort of the productive and the consumption regime and the infrastructure regime. But at the same time, also questions sort of the assumptions around that, there is sort of a trickle down sort of positive spillover from all the innovation happening within the sort of production regime of cities. And a final, again, very open question is what your thoughts are around sort of the purchase of your work and your research for what has been sort of quite a sort of a tradition in a lot of urban sustainability transition research around action research. And it's very much sort of stemming from a lot of the work coming from transition management that has been very much applied to cities. And again, I feel, your work is doing a great job in terms of explaining transition dynamics. But I think what a lot of sort of urban scholars in sustainability transitions are very much concerned about is also enacting transitions. So it'd be kind of curious to hear a bit more about that. I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Lars. Very good questions and comments. So perhaps, Jim, if you could just respond to these, very big questions in a concise and short way, because we have a few also very interesting questions from the chat room. So
great. No, these are fantastic points, Lars. Thank you. Yeah, very quickly. So the first question, it's interesting. It's kind of like you accurately called me out on this, on my anthropocentricity, and I appreciate that. I mean, and I'll just lay it on the table. I mean, part of my problem, because when I first started my doctoral studies, I was going to do like sustainable agriculture, agroecological systems, and that's kind of what I was going towards. And then I was kind of like, people like, there's this kind of this imposition of a particular kind of sustainability narrative upon, post-colonial subjects and places that are basically operating in a highly organic fashion anyway. They're not very intensive agricultural systems. So I didn't feel very comfortable about that. The environmental implications, the natural implications of the way cities are developing in Africa is hugely significant. So you think about climate change in particular. I think it's Kate Maher's done some really interesting work looking at temperatures that are the temperatures in cities and stuff. So I don't stress that as much, in part because I guess I am taking it. I'm focusing more on people's lives in their sense, their ability to have a chance for social mobility, stability, not living hand to mouth. And I see that from my perspective as a primary interest, because again, I'm coming out of a kind of human-centered development tradition, economic tradition. But on the other hand, you can't understand the quality of life in a city like Nairobi is, without the constant, the fumes, the pollution, the solid waste issues, the smell of sewage. It's hugely significant and problematic. But I guess I get worried about approaches that maybe place that first over the lives and livelihoods of people in cities, which I think are, to me, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. I prioritize those in the short run. Innovation, production regime, yeah, I think that's a really fair point. I think there's all kinds of experimentation and innovation going on with the way people have to manage their lives in an informal settlement, for example. How do people make ends meet? So there's, and these aren't heroic innovations. These aren't capital I innovations per se, or capital E experiments, but there's all kinds of agencies that are going on that, again, if we look at practices, we see, as Bernard and knows well, we see the coping mechanisms, we see the strategies, we see the way people, you know, and to me, it's always been quite remarkable, to put it mildly, how people can in really challenging material conditions be so incredibly innovative and progressive in their own way with very limited resources. And so there's a ton of that going on. And I think it's a really important point to highlight that more. And the same thing goes on around infrastructure regimes as well, the way people collectively create systems for distributing access to water. So a lot of this goes outside the realm of the state, where a household that has a water tap in a city will, you know, provide water for the neighbors, for example, and do it at a very low cost, you know. So I think that's a really important point, to not fetishize innovation as only being part of the production regime. I'm not so sure about the third question. I may ask for clarification on that if we have a little more time, because I'm not clear exactly what that is. So I apologize. But we should go back to that. I want to get clarity on that. And the last thing, very quickly, on action research, I think the most significant thing there is the placemaking stuff, I think, in particular. So there, and as well as thinking about innovators and people who want to figure out how to have an innovation or an experiment that they want to conduct, to understand in terms, how does it articulate with the way people make a living? How does it articulate with you know, the kinds of constraints household budgets have with respect to consumption on rent and consumption on school fees and consumption on other things? So that's one part of it. But the placemaking is really significant. And if you think about like transition managers, really part of what a transition management dynamic is about, again, putting forth an alternative vision about a place, right? And then thinking about how you form a coalition around that vision in order to fight the dominant, you know, hegemonic or obdurate frame that's out there. And so I think that is absolutely relevant for placemaking. And you see that in the case of the Automobility, in particular in Montreal, where you can really see pieces, if you're a transition manager, how do we name and blame this? How do we claim this? And then how do we practice this? So I do think there's relevance there. And apologies on the third question.
Great, Jim. Very quick and very dense answers, and really very inspiring. So I guess we can continue at the same level now, you know, high speed. I have a first bunch of 3 comments, which relates mostly on your concept of city as a social-technical regime and how this relates to other understandings of regimes. We had this discussion already a few times. So the first contribution is by Jonas Torrens, who essentially says that the tradition in the MLP, the alignment between intra-regime rules is seen contributing to the regime stability and its strong path dependency, and the misalignments due to land squeeze pressures, etc., create an opening for niches and destabilizations. Here you present an argument where the mal and non-alignment across different intra-urban regimes is the source of the problems, which the transitions would address. Is this contrast due to the different context of application or a different understanding of what alignments are? This very clear question, but you know, it's sort of similar to the next one by Gilles Debizet, shortening a bit, where he said the sociotechnical regime as defined by the MLP combines infrastructure, market, and policy, and consequently the 3 dimensions of production, consumption, and infrastructure. You propose to dissociate these 3 dimensions into 3 related regimes. How then do you define a regime? What analytical and heuristic possibility does this decomposition offer? I guess it's again a question about your understanding of regime and let's say a social technical regime. And the third one, you have already, Lars also already alluded to that, by Tristan Barrett. So how does this kind of framework intersect with systems framework like socio-ecological, social-technical systems? Is there complementarity here? So how would you position your understanding in these broader contexts?
Okay, yeah, so yeah, I think maybe with the first 2 questions, I guess maybe I'm not orthodox a consumer of the MLP, so maybe I'm just a little bit too you know, out in outer space on some of this. But I think the issue here I don't necessarily think that there's a disagreement here in my mind. It's just, you know, I guess I'm seeing with respect to Gilles' comment, when you say the MLP combines infrastructure, market, and policy, I would suggest that the MLP, though, is focused at how those relate to a specific sector, whether it's energy or water or sanitation. So yes, I'm not saying that those aren't relevant within, say, my understanding of an infrastructure regime, but I'm saying, how do those markets, policy connect to, you know, other activities that go on in cities that are essential for what cities do and why people go to cities, and, you know, what cities are supposed to be for wider forms of economic development. So I don't think I'm dissociating. I think I'm very much interconnecting and interrelating. I just think I'm trying to provide a heuristic for folks to get outside the sector and to connect and to see other sectors or other activities that go on in cities through the lens of, say, you enter through the infrastructure, but then you see, well, people aren't using this particular form of transportation in part because it's not really relevant for the kinds of jobs that are available in the economy or the kinds of income that are available in the economy. And then you say, well, what would that take to kind of improve that situation? What would be a way to align those practices with the practices of people's actual everyday lives? And I think that that's part of it as well. And I mean, I think in terms of, so I would say the other thing about that is, it is a function of the context of the application here. I'm working in a very different kind of place than, say, you know, Amsterdam. And it's not, so cities are not constituted in such coherent regimes as you might find in the case of European cities in particular. But the development challenges are enormous. And so trying to impose a kind of Eurocentric understanding of a regime onto an African city, I think, can be very problematic if it doesn't enable you to see the heterogeneity, the fragmentations, the you know, as Mara van Wheely's paper with Bernard and I and Pauline talks about, that these are heterogeneous regimes. They're not monolithic. And I think we have to develop better means to kind of see those things. And what's not clear in the way I presented my framework, to be fair, is how I see those fragmentations, those heterogeneities within those particular regimes. I could certainly talk about that, but I think that's part of what we've been trying to work through, is to really get at the fact that there are multiple regimes around water that exist, or sanitation that exist in a city like Nairobi, and so I think so the idea that there's a singular regime is not really effective in helping us understand how sustainability transitions can fully work for development. Last thing on Tristan's question, yeah, I think I'm familiar with the SES and certainly with the STS. I think it's kind of inspired out of STS in particular. I think the SES point comes out of Lars's initial comment about nature and ecology there. I think there absolutely can be, and I think that's up to others perhaps to develop that complementarity. I mean, I think I'm not particularly, my focus isn't particularly on an explicit engagement with SES per se. It's more an engagement with urban economic geography and development studies around cities and transition in Africa. But I definitely could, you know, I think there is a potential for an intersection and a complementarity there.
I guess potentially we have here a little bit of a confusion with acronyms. At least I read STS as social-technical systems, and I guess you are now responding to science and technology studies.
No, I was thinking social and technical systems.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Then it was my misunderstanding. I have just sort of a follow-up question, which, you know, to me, the big jump that when I heard and read the paper of Jim is really this how to conceptually move from a single sector, you know, which we transition studies people are all obsessed about, to go, you know, to a sort of a place where different things interact, and how can we then meaningfully talk about these interdependencies. And that's also where Emil Evenhuis comes in. He says his alignment between production, consumption, and infrastructure seems realistic at the urban level of scale. The alignment between these regimes may also be at higher levels of scale, perhaps, or is alignment in cities a normative ideal? So where do the alignments play out? You know, is this a global thing or a national, or is it, you know, is this sort of a normative ideal that everything is just well aligned and then everyone is happy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, so if you look at the Zanzibar case, just to, you know, use that as in relationship to the regime ideas, you know, that there's more of an alignment with global capital in terms of the way that that place, that region, if you will, is being kind of, its infrastructure is developing, its production regime is developing, and the kind of subsequent consumption that goes on there. So that's a really interesting point. I think, so in that case, you could argue that the evolution of that place is much more aligned to the priorities of speculative investors in places like mainland Africa, and the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere, who are pumping a lot of money into there. So that, and I think that's a really interesting point. Is alignment normative? It's an interesting question, right? I think, to me, there is a normative dimension to it, in the sense that if we can think about, if we think about the city's exchange value, what it's producing for trade outside of the region, if you will, the city region, and how that relates to the use value, quality of life, the amenities, the kinds of experiences that people in that, you know, region have, and questions around poverty and livelihood, then to me, you do want to have that exchange value aligned with a use value that's conducive to everybody having a higher quality of life, having greener spaces, having cleaner air, those kinds of things. And that, of course, relates to the infrastructure as well. How you do that, I think, is interesting, right? Do you have to have one singular kind of model, one singular kind of way to regime that does all those alignments? I think that may be very unrealistic. But I think we need to think about sort of what are we can enter into this through different kinds of segments of populations in cities. And I would suggest normatively that we want to think very carefully about those who are most marginalized in cities, the poor, and the people who are living hand to mouth, and think about how does the production regime in the particular city align with their use value, their quality of life. Is it producing money for outsiders, or is it producing money that can go into investments in collective goods like education and other services? So I do think alignments are important to consider normatively.
Yeah, I guess that there's a sort of a follow-up question, a little bit off by Sybille Lebouy. How can actors mobilize more effectively alternative place frames?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, again, it goes back to like the coalition building, and I think it goes back to often you can think about multi-scalar coalitions too. Like, so a good example of this would be Ilda Lindell's done some really interesting work in Maputo, Mozambique, looking at street traders who enrolled a global NGO that focuses on like something like, I forget which one it was specifically, but there's like global NGOs or international NGOs that advocate on behalf of street traders, and so you can mobilize an alternative vision of place effectively, in part by bringing in actors, external actors or more powerful actors, and getting them to buy into your particular place frame. How you do that is obviously challenging, because sometimes what it means is, in order to open up that frame, you may have to dilute some aspects of it, right, to make it more conducive to a particular kind of consensus. I mean, just look at, you know, the presidential election that just happened here. I mean, the coalition of the Democrats had to be incredibly wide in order to and so there's going to be interesting processes, things that come out of that in terms of how the U.S. as a place is framed in terms of whose priorities matter, how far to the left policy goes in the current context.
Okay, thank you. So Jörg Mosiolik had an interesting question about, is there any hope to be taken from digitalization? So will digitalization sort of improve alignments between city systems, and is this relevant for sustainability transitions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think like, for example, I think just about things like mobile money in Kenya, like M-Pesa, which I think does kind of really facilitate, it does ease the kind of ways in which transactions occur. It facilitates transfers of money within families. So I think there's a positive aspect to that, and it can help to better align certain aspects of systems. So you pay your water bill through your M-Pesa, and you also can pay get your income that way, and those kinds of things. So I do think, but I think it's also fraught, and some of the work I've done with Parag Carmody on looking at ICTs in Africa has shown that this digitalization has been in many ways very thinly integrated into systems, or in some ways problematically integrated. So I call it the tyranny of TripAdvisor. So if you're in Zanzibar and you're a small Zanzibari-owned bed and breakfast, how do you get the visibility through that digitalization? How do you outmaneuver the Airbnb, which creates a certain kind of relationship of trust with foreigners and consumers who are going to come and be tourists? So I think it can actually facilitate new forms of extraction. And I just think in Massachusetts, TripAdvisor, Expedia, whatever, has just built a mansion of a new headquarters here. And I think about all the TripAdvisor reviews that I've looked at, and all the TripAdvisor activities that intermediate between the actual on-the-ground tour operators and small business owners in places like Zanzibar and these foreign tourists. And a lot of that value gets extracted offshore. So I do think it's not as straightforward. I think in terms of smart cities, I think there's a question about whether there's an attempt to try to leapfrog around some of the challenges in a city like Nairobi, and at whose expense. If you're spending, because the cost of it is the issue for me. If you're going to spend money on sensors and all kinds of devices that are associated with smart cities, what are you not spending money on that can be much more fundamental to people's lives? And I wonder if that may also be problematic.
Good point, Jim. I guess we're slowly running out of time, but I have a last really great question from Lucy Oates about, do you see opportunities to link transition studies more to development outcomes in theory and or practice, links with development studies, southern urbanism, etc.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's funny. I've been, I've interacted with folk. I mean, I've been in development studies for a long time, and I teach development theory, and I have students doing southern urbanisms. So I think there's a whole mess of potential impacts. I mean, one of the challenges, to be honest with that, particularly if you're talking about like more critical development studies, is a kind of resistance, I would suggest, or dislike, or maybe, fear of systems thinking. So I think with like political ecologists, urban political ecologists, who I've interacted a lot with, there's a kind of concern about this being this kind of a totalizing approach to understanding things that immediately sparks a very critical kind of reaction. And so I think one of the challenges is to develop ways to effectively have dialogue with those different communities, develop trading zones. I think development studies, I'm seeing in more quote unquote mainstream development studies, I'm definitely seeing that emerge more commonly, but I think if you're getting, the engagement like with critical infrastructure studies and things like that, I think is a bit more challenging, but I think it's work that's important to do, because I think there is a value added to thinking more, in some ways more systematically, but not necessarily in a totalizing, essentializing way. I just think about ways in which there are these comparative dimensions of urban experiences around the world that we need to be able to develop general ideas and theories from, but doesn't have to be truth with a capital T.
Thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks a lot for all the questions we got. It has really been a very dense and intense exchange, and very interesting at each moment of time. There was not a single hangover in between. So we're reaching the end, and Christian is chipping in just for some last announcements.
Yeah, so thanks a lot to all of you for this very interesting session and the great questions. So next week is going to be the last session of this webinar series. It's going to be a roundtable discussion about what's next for GeoST. And so I think it's a sort of a special session because we also want to spend some time on sort of, practical issues, what you could do next as a community, also in the scope of this SRN thematic group, which will be inaugurated very soon. So in that sense, I would ask you to also get in touch with me or the others, with inputs if you have sort of really burning questions that we should address in this roundtable. And also if you have, concrete ideas what we could do next as a community. So we can take this up, potentially in this next session. And please also fill in the survey. We will sort of follow up with the survey, and we actually read, the inputs you have there. So it would be very much appreciated if you have some feedback on how these webinars are run, so we can also learn and improve for potential next webinar series. So that's it. Yeah, please sign up for the next session. I'm looking forward to meeting you again next week, and have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and see you next time. Bye-bye.